The same YouTube channel link. We don't have specific links for the live. It says we are going live on YouTube.
I've forwarded that.
Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma. And today we are here to have a panel discussion after a long time. You have seen lectures, you have seen conversations, but rarely panel discussions on Caravan. But I thought this would be a nice day to have a panel discussion on a very important theme. I think for the last many months, there has been a debate on social media and among the academia about public and academic history. And we will get into the conversation to talk about how academics approach writing history, or is academic history public, and how public is, if so, how public is academic history. These are questions that we'll try to figure out in this conversation. I've got five very important historians and thinkers of our times to have this conversation. All of you who are watching us can ask their questions via the live chat. We'll take some of your questions as well while this conversation is on. So I'll just introduce our speakers, though none of them need any introduction. You see their books in my background, and you must have read their books. Professor Sudeshna Guha is a professor in the Department of History and Archaeology at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University. Her research spans the histories of visualization, social histories of archaeology, and the making of archaeological heritage and national cultures. Trained in field archaeology, she has an extensive background in curatorship, having managed historical photographic archives and archaeological collections. And her scholarships examine shifts in historiographical method and notions of evidence, explored in works such as Artifacts of History, which was published by Sage, which delves into Indian archaeology's historiography. The Marshall Albums, Photography and Archaeology, which explores colonial era photographic practices of the Archaeological Survey of India. Her latest book, A History of India in 75 Objects, presents Indian history through a curated selection of artifacts, and she's also developing research on state formation in Sikkim and post colonial archaeology of cultural heritage in South Asia. Our next speaker, Professor Ruby Lal, is a professor of South Asian history at Emory University and a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist. Her latest book, Vagabond Princess: The Adventures of Kulbadan, was published in 2024 by Yale University Press and has been widely acclaimed and shortlisted for the Kandil History Prize. Her previous work, Empress: The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan, won the Georgia Author of the Year award in Biography and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize in History. Empress was also named a top 10 book by Time magazine and has been optioned by Lionsgate, for adaptation. And her forthcoming book is a young adult adaptation of Empress, Tiger Slayer. I think the book is towards its finalization now, and it features illustration by Molly Crabapple. And her scholarship extends to gender and cultural histories with works such as Domesticity and Power in Early Mughal World and the Coming of Age in 19th Century India, The Girl Child and the Art of Playfulness. She has held various prestigious fellowships, including the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies and the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. And she contributes to major international publications and frequently engages in literary festivals, public talks, and media discussions. Our next speaker is Professor Anirudh Deshpande. Professor Deshpande is a professor in the Department of History at Delhi University, a distinguished historian of military and social history, and has been published extensively on colonial and modern South Asia. His book include The British Raj and its Indian Armed Forces, 1857 to 1939, British Military Policy in India, 1900 to 1945, 1900 to 1945, Colonial Constraints and Declining Power, Class, Power and Consciousness in Indian Cinema and Television, and much recently has written a book called King, Country and War, Ideology, Memory, and Written Indian History from 1600 to 1900, which explores these themes of historical memory and identity. A former Nehru Memorial Museum and Library Fellow, he has contributed to international scholarship, including the Wars of East India Company in the International Encyclopedia of War, edited by Gordon Martel. Our next speaker is Professor Arupjyoti Saikia. He is working with Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, as a professor of history and has held fellowships at Yale University, the Agrarian Studies Program, Cambridge University, and the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, London. His research focuses on environmental and agrarian histories with key publications including Forest and Ecological History of Assam, from 1826 to 2000, A Century of Protest, Peasant Politics in Assam since 1900, The Unquiet River, a very popular book, a biography of the Brahmaputra, and much recently, The Modern History of Assam, The Making of Modern Assam. His work has been widely recognized with Srikant Dutt Book Prize for his book A Century of Protest and the A.K. Coomaraswamy Book Prize for his book The Unquiet River. Finally, our speaker, Professor A.R. Venkat Shelapati. He's a historian, a writer, and currently a professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai. His research focuses on the social, cultural, and intellectual history of colonial Tamil Nadu. He has taught at various universities and in Tirunelveli, Chennai, Singapore, and Chicago, and has had research fellowships in Paris, Cambridge, London, and Harvard. He is a recipient of the V.K.R.V. Rao Prize and has been honored with a lot of other prizes, including this year's Sahitya Academy Award for his book on I think I have copy of his book which got the award for Swadeshi Stream. This was the original in Tamil got the award, and I hope we'll talk about the regional aspect of history writing also with Professor Venkat Chelapati. So without further ado, I hope these introductions itself have given us the idea how historians, how academics engage with the public and are actively engaging with this large public that we think of. So we'll start with some opening remarks. So I'll ask Professor Ruby Lal to start with her opening remarks, and we'll have Professor Sudeshna Guha.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you for the wonderful work you've been doing. I mean, I think these are questions of civilization in a way. And of course, I'm very delighted to meet my co-panelists. I've only met Sudeshna before, not the others. We have, 3 to 4 minutes, so I'm going to this is like speaking on your life's work in about 3 to 4 minutes. So I'll do the best that I can. But basically, what I want to do is just to say that in my writing and in my thinking, really, all the categories that we are interested in exploring here are up for grabs. I mean, these are public and history, the outside and the intellectual inside work, the question of sources. These are also rift with forms of binaries that have come to be implanted in all of this. So, for instance, public is totally removed from history. The so-called popular or the accessible. These are all categories and these are all terms that I continue to think. So I want to start with public here, right? The assumption in much of the writing that public is somehow out there, right? Ready for us seers to, go out and speak. I find that position extremely uncomfortable. And it's a position of self-critique that, just because we have expertise of various kinds, philosophically, linguistically, in terms of cultural enunciations. It's one mustn't have this position of arrogance that somehow I'm going to write these histories and people will take it. So in other words, I think public must be and is verb. In other words, it's a constantly changing, constantly evolving. What is public, right? What is public today? Which public are we talking about? Who are we talking to? I find that my own works since Empress, they've actually leaned on the questions that people in the so-called public, were asking me. The glint in the eye of the people, the questions that absorb them, their angst, their worries, that sort of thing. So that's, I think, a reminder for me as an academic to think, there's a lot to be said about public. Likewise, history for us academics also, but also I think this whole controversy has arisen because there's this idea that somehow, academics are not doing the work of public. So really in that, what is history? The grounds of history are not and have never been given, right? How do we engage a central quest in history, for example, what is evidence, right? How do we approach the philosophies of evidence? Who decides what evidence is? I think all of us here can attest to the fact that the sort of histories that we have been able to produce were traditionally not sayable, were not allowable, because it was imagined that there were no sources for it, right? So for instance, how does one think? One of the things that I've been engaged with in all my works for a very long time now is, I'm supposed to be a textualist, right? And mostly textualists will use, or a word again I find very uncomfortable, read paintings, or at most miniature paintings, Mughal miniature in the world that I work with, or insert them as illustrations in the text. But it's a whole, you don't read paintings, as Kavita will tell you, as many other people will tell you, right? There are serious iconographies. There are textures. You don't look at paintings, you look in it, right? So there are very, I think, likewise things that I think Sudeshna here will tell us a lot more. I've been thinking a lot about, the things that we hold, right? What does holding mean? How do things animate, a whole body of life, of living, of culture? And then the third category, I'm just kind of putting up categories that are really, undecided, unsettled. Storytelling, right? It's assumed that there is a form of storytelling. I mean, in the the gloriously rich and complex cultures of storytelling that we inhabit in South Asia, is it really settled, right? I mean, I grew up, my mother is a fantastic storyteller, and I grew up hearing stories from her. Among them was Noor Jahan. And I had not thought about that moment till I began writing that book, right? So what did storytelling mean, right? How was I to implot the storytelling onto writing this book that I was writing? So I think the form of story, and I can I don't want to take too much time here. I can say a ton on the idea of storytelling. Most importantly, I do want to emphasize that it is not a settled, form. And therefore, to this larger point through this that I'd like to make, which is that I think on both sides, academics practicing wider forms of engagement, playing with newer kinds of narratives, have to be aware that storytelling is not decided. The form is not decided, right? It's something I take extremely seriously, the form. And the form changes. It keeps evolving. It's a practice. Ishan, you just mentioned the young adult book that's due out in August. It's an entirely different form. Young adult does not mean half adult. It's a full form, right? I had to teach myself, nor did I imagine that the young learners for who I was writing, the history of Noor Jahan, that it had to be somehow watered down. That was not the idea. So how to tell this, how to work with an artist, right? Who was engaging the pictorial form. And we both, Molly and I, spoke about this and realized that the textual is visual and the visual has to lean on the textual. So there are lots of things here. I will at the end say finally to my fantastic cohort who's outside the academy but writing these things, to also not assume that the kinds of things that we do, I mentioned this almost in a breath, it's our life's work to think these iconographies, to think philosophies of history writing, the questions we ask, right? So it's not that you know a few texts and you can go and write these histories, right? I think there has to be this understanding that that the evidence, histories of productions of texts, iconographies of material objects, these are very deeply implicated in life. So I think there's need for self-critique on all sides. It's only I think those are the only grounds. I believe history is the work of civilization, right? Everywhere. I mean, there's tons of gerrymandering that's going on. There's kind of very potent erasures that affect, citizenship and belonging. So I think there are very serious issues for us. So I'm really grateful that we are having this conversation. For sure, we are not going to settle anything here. So I think I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Professor Lal. Of course, this is, I think, a beginning to a new kind of conversations that we must have within academia and outside it for a better present and a better future, I hope, for this discipline of history. Over to Professor Sudeshna Guha.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you for the wonderful introduction to all of us. And I must say that I'm really least prepared in this conversation because I really think that the reason why we are having this discussion today is because public history has become a conundrum. I mean, there has been this charge against historians that because they do not speak to the public, other people are writing, and we have what is called as a WhatsApp history. I think we know where it's coming from. Now, there are two sides to this. I come from a discipline of archaeology, which, in terms of looking at the history of archaeology, it's always been a public-facing, discipline-making subject. So there is a conundrum there. What is the public? As Rubilal said very clearly, who is the public? What do we identify? In archaeology, the idea had been because we waste or we spend, and you can see the way I kind of play around with my words, the public funds for excavation, we need to be accountable to the public. So that is public archaeology, having a public face for this. But the public is not allowed to engage with archaeological methodology, etc. I mean, that is where the discipline making comes in. In the museum world, where you have collections management, one of the first things one does when you think in terms of indigenous people or people whose ancestral collections we hold, there, when a curator goes into the field, you just don't go into the indigenous world and say, hey, who's got something out there? You actually talk to the chief. So we always make a selection of who the public is. Who are we actually speaking to? In my own work, in Artifacts of History, I actually wrote a book because I wanted to write it for myself. I wasn't really thinking about anybody I was speaking to. I didn't want to. I was trying to find out. And that's one of the reasons why I'm still an academic, because I want to find out. And I guess where I have become, or I guess one of the reasons I might be here on this panel is because I've written this History of India through 75 objects. And that has been a very difficult book to write because I did not find my own voice for a long time. What it came up to be was a compendium, an encyclopedia of other people's voices, other people's things. But writing that also made me realize one thing, which is when we pick up other people's work or we eliminate other people's work, when it comes to somebody who is not from the history or is not a historian, he's just picking up things, putting things together, he or she, and then telling you that this is a past, they don't seem to explain what they have left out. And I think that is very important to think in terms, to keep that in mind. And a historian, for me, one of the public historians for me, when I think back, when I was growing up, when I was studying history, has always been Ramila Thapar, who's actually come up, spoken about history, told you there is a historical truth. Whether we take it or not, that's a different thing. But when history has been threatened, when people have been saying something or the other, she has taken issues at stake. And for me, if you can, that is probably the public face of a historian. So popularizing your own work, there are many issues which arise from it. I think I'm not sure if you really want to popularize your own work. I think what we are all kind of looking at is we would like people to read our books. And there you also think in today's world of publishing, you have the publishers who kind of say they want certain kinds of histories being written. I am one of those fierce people who think that you write, you do something, you are in academics, you want to find out, you want to engage your students with aspects of history. History is about endowments of historicity. Histories are complex, and any person, I think, literate or not, if you give them that complexity in all its complexity, and if you are patient with them to explain that to them, they would understand. So what is happening in the ways of popular histories today are simple narratives are being written. And I would really hope that those narratives and that historians kind of turn back, archaeologists also turn back and say things are not that simple. And we need to give that complexity in its full array out in the outer world out there. So that's something I have to say. The other thing is, of course, when you think, the sciences also have the same problems in many places where scientists are asked, physicists are asked to kind of make something easy. But you need to be a really, really good historian. You need to be really good in your craft to make something easy, to make something, to kind of say it. And I think what I know from my peers and my teachers, and it's also from places in Cambridge, where you can only do that when you're really good at your craft. And I think some of the most successful people who have been able to publicize history and be the public face of history have been one of the most eminent historians I know. So I would like to stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Guha. Over to Professor Anirudh Deshpande.
Yeah, thank you, Ishan, for having me on this program and putting me in the company of such exciting scholars who probably know more about the subject than I do to begin with. See, I have always seen myself not only as a professional practicing historian in a history department in the university, but I've always seen myself, as you know very well, as a public historian in the sense that for the last several decades, I have written extensively in the PW, in several newspapers, and especially from the late 90s, the middle of the 20th, 21st century, I know I have foray. And many good Indian historians operating in both the formats. They are both academic historians as well as public historians and public intellectuals. Sudeshna referred to Ramila Thapar, my former teacher at the CHS, who's not only a public historian, but she's a great public intellectual as well, and that's one of the reasons why she's reviled so much in certain circles, which are part of the public, which doesn't really read much. So what I'm going to, I'm connected with a number of groups in some parts of the country where public history is being practiced in the non-English speaking world. So, see, you have in India, obviously, you always have this division between the English media and the non-English media. So you have a local, let's say you have You have groups in Maharashtra, or you have groups in Madhya Pradesh, or you have groups in even in Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, who, there are groups of activists, groups of college teachers, school teachers who are well-meaning and who'd like their students and the people they address in general in their meetings to know more about quote unquote the correct version of history. Now, it's a little unfashionable to speak in these terms these days because historians, faced with this charge of not having addressed the public enough, which is, I think, a false charge, tend to agonize a little too much about their craft. I saw a bit of that agonizing in Rubilal's presentation, with all respect. So it's okay. We don't really have to talk in very abstract or theoretical or philosophical terms when we are practicing the craft for the public, or if we don't even have to do that. Those things can actually inform our work subconsciously and indirectly as we go on and we write histories of various kinds. So, number one, we have to decide who the public is in the first place. Are we just going to write for those who read and write in English? In any case, not many Indians read, and whatever little reading habit Indians had, especially amongst the students. I mean, students who used to read. I remember now we are coming across increasingly we are coming across students who don't have the reading habit, who don't read. Now we are talking about history students. We're not talking about the general public which doesn't read, which just goes to the social media and sees things. So it's the YouTube videos or the TikToks or things like that, or you have short clips and so on which they watch and they absorb a lot of history through those clips and so on. And of course, cinema films which present history as fantasy to people. So the problem of one of the problems of being a public historian in India is that in the Indian public, everybody thinks he's a historian. So the problem with India is the moment you tell somebody that you are a history professor, you start getting a lecture history yourself. So I've actually stopped telling people that I teach history at the university level because I've done that. I mean, in all innocence, I've done that on airports and in aeroplanes and in trains and so on, and only to be lectured on what history should be and how people have been. Even auto rickshaw drivers have told me that they've been taught wrong history and so on. So it's gone down so deep. So you're actually getting a lesson in public history all the time as you speak to the public and interact with the public. So we have to negotiate with all these things and then see how we can write public history meaningfully. But to begin with, and as I have said that, I mean, in my previous program with you, remember, we touched these things. We spoke about things like public history. We spoke about WhatsApp histories. We spoke about weekend historians. Uh, and, uh, I think, number one, I think this charge that historians have not written for the public is it's a little too much because I don't think this charge actually sticks. If you look at the newspapers in the last 25, 30 years, or if you look at the magazines and journals, if you look at something like the Frontline or Caravan, or if you look at things like, let's say, even the Outlook that used to carry good historical pieces. Recently, there was an issue of Outlook which actually focused on archaeology and the ASI and so on and so forth in very easy and readable language, which anybody who reads simple English can understand. So I think it's not so much a question of there not having been public history. Historians in India have always been public historians. Romila has been a public historian. Bipan Chandra used to write articles in newspapers. Even people like R.S. Sharma, D.N. Jha used to write articles in newspapers regularly. Similarly, Irfan Habib, he's a great public historian. He keeps appearing on all kinds of. He's always appeared on TV programs. He's always appeared on YouTube, and even even on the official media for that matter, till the current government actually put an end to the program. You had certain programs which the public historian and public intellectual, my friend Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay used to hold a program on Rajya Sabha TV. You must remember, it was like the program you do. It used to be called A Page from History, in which various historians would be called, and there would be a lively debate about events which were relatively unknown to the people. So public history in India has always been there. Uh, Today it has become very fashionable to say that weekend historians have arrived and WhatsApp history is happening simply because Indian historians have abdicated their responsibility. I don't think that is necessarily true. At the subterranean level, in the in the non-academic history world, where regional histories flourish and where identitarian histories have flourished for a long period, uh, over the last 70, 80 years, there is a commonsensical view of history which is repeated ad nauseum in the local press and in the local media and in cinema and so on and so forth. Something with which historians do contend.
Yeah.
And I think historians are actually writing good stuff on the new kind of media you find on the scroll or wire or other alternative media and so on. So I think it's a very lively history in India has always been a very lively subject. People take great interest in it, obviously sometimes for the wrong reasons, but it's always been a lively subject, and it has always kept the historians occupied with ideas. And it's a very simple play of facts and interpretations,
Yeah.
which actually the historians indulge in when they talk of public history. So we have to eschew the bigger philosophical or theoretical categories. I mean, if we don't speak in those languages, but we simplify the argument and basically pitch it on the basis of the kind of information available in the sources, which comes as a check on these prejudices which are being portrayed as history today. I think public history was always being done.
Yeah.
It's being done, and I think it will continue to be done despite the risks associated with doing
We
public history in India today, and the risky environment in general in which historians seem to function these days, both inside and outside the academia.
yeah.
That's,
We we we
that's my two bit on the subject. I mean, I've not come prepared with a lecture or something like that. So that's what I feel, and I
we
always,
will.
I always defend my cohort. I always defend my colleagues when such charges are hurled at the historians in the public domain. Obviously,
We will
with data, with data.
we will get into these in detail in the conversation, of course, because these are very, very important themes of discussion that we will do. I'll ask Professor Arupjyoti Saikia to present his opening remarks, and we'll have to just keep our opening remarks to 4 minutes, because then we won't have time to have a conversation in details.
Right. Thank you, Isan. Wonderful to be here, and thank you for. I really learned from my previous speakers. The co-panelists have really spelled out the key issues that is we are confronting today. I definitely agree on one principal idea that for the last probably more than 100 years, in English and probably in many Indian languages, Indian historians and others, they have really given a new trust, new directions, and taken strong leadership in helping the craft to get maturity and really a new kind of dynamism. Indian historians who wrote in Bengali, in Assamese, with my own familiarity, my limited familiarity, I know that they have been writing in very careful way, in the most perfectionist manner, paying attention to the larger questions of the historical craft, and also trying to think about their readership. They have paid attention to two major issues: the questions of the archive, questions of the sources, issues of truth, issues of historical generalizations, and all the kind of check and balance that you require to be a good historian. Then they also thought about their readerships, because as all the speakers have really pointed out, that Indian readers are deeply involved and they are continuously looking forward to the issues of past. And the Indian historians, they have definitely they have played their big role in the last more than 100 years. Some of are being written and produced in English language, but probably in the last 30, 40 years, or probably a little bit more, as the universities became more important player in the production of the historical knowledge, uh, the same process went on. The universities, colleges, and other academic bodies, wherever there were historians who were teaching, writing, they were engaged, they remain a public figure. Most of the Indian historical questions are essentially a product of larger public concerns, right? You know, throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Indian historians paid careful attention to the long history of the Indian society, Indian civilizations. For example, so much of work that have been written, produced about India's anti-imperialist project, right? The Great Freedom Movement. So much of work have been. There are different kind of ideological moorings, right? Different ways these ideas were being produced. But most of these scholarships were product of very high standards. The kind of philosophical engagement they had, they were really of critical natures. They tried to engage with the larger public concerns. However, over a period of time, probably as English became one of the major sites of production of this knowledge, maybe my co-panelists can correct me, maybe the way those findings, those knowledge and everything was presented, probably it required, there were slight probably deviations from what a general average reader can comprehend or probably can think of, or probably they can find their familiarity with this kind of text. What I have noticed that despite these limitations, Indian historians, they paid to three important dimensions: prose, extraordinarily curated prose. In fact, many of the historians of probably early in 20th century, they were some of the finest literary people also. So prose remained a very important component for them. So this means that they remained a powerful defender of public history. The questions, many of them, they continue to write in Indian languages. Apart from that, they were equally fluent in English. The third, in India, the academic history remained a very, very powerful domain. I think these three issues helped Indian history to remain in the public domain. That's why so much of criticisms. That's why so much of interest, even amongst the publishers, to keep on engaging with the Indian historians, and that the discipline has survived in the Indian universities. Right? See the number of graduates, undergraduates who read and who remain interested in the subject. I think these equations of academic history, this is also equally important. So apart from the prose, apart from the Indian languages, apart from the sophistications that Indian historians have developed in terms of their prose, their craft, their readerships, right? I think it remained always equations of public history. How do we see it? It is a different matter altogether.
Thank you so much, Professor Saikia. Over to Professor Venkat Chilapati. So you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Ishan, for this opportunity. Let me make my comments based on my own experience of becoming a historian. I began as a public historian because I didn't read history. So when I was in college as a BCom graduate, I went to the archives and then I wrote primarily in Tamil. The moment I wrote in Tamil, the audience was a literary audience, a public audience. There was no real audience for a work of history in Tamil. So I had to address, perforce, a literary audience, which meant that I had to write well, use literary devices to tell my story. So only after I wrote and published for a literary audience for a few years, then it dawned on me that a formal training in history is very, very important. So this is something that is completely missed by those who are hurling charges at historians that they are not writing for the public. Unlike other disciplines, history is very deceptive. It doesn't seem to have on the face of it very clear methods and methodologies. You know what it takes to become a physicist or a sociologist, but we really don't know what it takes, what training is required to be a historian. It takes a while to catch that. So it is then that I introduced myself to formal training in history. So this has meant that right from the beginning, I had to keep an audience in mind. But it was an audience that did not exist. Unlike in other languages, the audience for history writing did not exist in the portals of universities and colleges. So this is the challenge that one faced in the Tamil context. So my way of writing has been that it's almost like a literary person. I write for myself. I pursue ideas that interest me. I look up material. I read old stuff, old records, old stories, old journals, old documents. And whatever interests me, I have pursued it. And that interest, the excitement that I get by engaging with what we call primary sources, I try to communicate it to an audience. So I believe that if a story interests me and if I can communicate that story to the putative audience, then the struggle is half won. The second part of this particular part is within our control. We can train ourselves. We can read good books. We can have good exemplars and try to emulate them. But the critics who are accusing professional historians of not writing, what they completely miss is that where are the institutional structures for it? When I began writing in the 80s, there were practically no non-academic publishers. It is only in the late 90s that Penguin started. Then subsequently you had HarperCollins, and now you have a whole range of international publishers coming. Now it seems to me that one aspect of the criticism has come up because there are too many publishers chasing too few authors, especially at a time when there are many, many interesting stories to tell, at a time when everybody seems to be interested in history. But what I would like to emphasize in my opening statement is that, yes, we need to write. History is too important to be left to historians. It is a cliche, but it is true. We need to write. Not everything can always be written for a larger audience. There are certain topics which can be discussed only among the specialists. That should be left aside. And also the fact that history is often confused only with events and personalities. So it becomes very difficult to address that. But as a general point, I would tell my fellow historians that one should wait like the proverbial stork waiting for the big fish. We all have many stories in our mind. We have done the groundwork, but we should look for the right moment, the moment at which that story might have more takers. So we have to be, in a very good sense, opportunistic. And I think there is a, despite the dangers that historians face now, I also think it is a moment of opportunity. Otherwise, why would anybody charge, historians who really don't matter to the society with, great responsibilities? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Venkat Chelapati. I think the stage is set for the conversation because I think we have had great opening remarks from all of you. I would like to start with Professor Arupjyoti Saikia. I think he wants to add something to what Professor Venkat Chelapati just said. So, Professor Saikia, if you would like to add something.
I think what Venkat said, I think is absolutely right. In India, especially those who are well versed in the Indian languages, non-English speaking world, right? This is not a well-trained and very highly specialized history reading public. It is an literate public. They are interested about the past, and I think this is what the historians in the previous generations, say 1920s, 1930s, they have done excellent work, right? They they essentially shaped their arguments, their narrative in such a way that the general reading public can make a sense of it, can be also be aware of the craft, the sophistication that is involved in the history writing process. And I think this is what all of us do. When we write, we are not only careful that our peers or the reviewers in the journal, how they will respond to our work. We are also concerned about our immediate reading public, because the immediate reading public, they are much more expert, they are much more specialist than probably a journal reviewer, because they know the larger story, they know the pulse of the kind of questions that normally we describe, the larger historical context that we are dealing with. And probably they know all the nuances, ups and down the archive in a different sense, right? So I think it is extremely difficult to persuade and to convince that readership that the narrative that I am telling, the kind of truth, the kind of historical specificities that I am dealing it, this is closer truth and this is what it looks like. It is really very difficult task, I think. And I think all of us have been trying to do that, trying to reach out to this readership. And this has helped Indian historians in a great manner. Writing to them, listening to their responses has always been a very helpful event for my own upbringing in the last few decades. Yeah, and this is what I'd like to add to Venkat's point.
Thank you, Professor Saikia.
I just want to
Yeah.
add a couple of things too. If you permit me to speak, I'll, I agree with, Venkat as well as Arupjyoti on this. I just want to add a few things which is making the position of the Indian historian very ironical in the current times. On the one hand, in the last 15, 20 years, we've seen publishers vying with each other to publish history books, because history suddenly become very popular in the sense that, I remember in the 1980s and 90s, we were hard put to find publishers who were willing to publish history volumes. But now apparently every publisher wants to do a little bit of history, because it's all market related. History now sells, especially a particular kind of history sells, and they want this popular kind of history writing, which sells, and obviously it's all profit driven and so on and so forth. While at the same time, you find historians are facing challenges from a variety of areas. Number one, this continuous attack on academic history is it's a veiled attack on the subject and concept of professional history itself. Now, why that is being done? That is being done very clearly by those people who know that from their ranks, not a single scholar of international repute has been produced. So the public, according to them, must be convinced that these professional historians, quote unquote, quote unquote, left leaning or whatever you have, that the professional academic historians produced in India in the last 70 years, especially in the years, in those decades when the BJP was not in power, are those historians who have told the Indian public wrong things about Indian history. Now, this is a very, it seems that they are trying to fashion a reinterpretation of history in the view of the public. The public is just now being led into an ambush, into a situation when very soon you will have the extinction of the professional well-trained historian, because he will be so devalued in the eyes of the public. And the way the university education is being restructured, the way the honors courses and the way the history is being taught in schools and colleges these days, with its mass media and with cinema playing an increasing role in the development of historical consciousness and collective consciousness among school-going children, you will soon have in India the professional, well-trained historian as an endangered species of academics. So we are fighting this on 2-3 fronts. Number one, we are trying to save our discipline from these attacks. So as as Venkat said, number one, we have to convince the public that everybody, although everybody has views on history, because as Eric Hobsbawm said once, everybody is a historian without realizing that he's a historian. But then everybody is not a trained historian.
Yeah, I'll come to that, Professor Deshpande, because we have mentioned this term of public a lot in our opening remarks as well as in the comments followed.
My aim was just to underline the formidable circumstances in which historians, especially the trained professional historians, seem to be working these days. That's it.
I'll come to Professor Lal, because in her article that she wrote for the Scroll, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned about both academic and popular histories, and you mentioned that somehow they exist in this make-believe world. And if you can make a comment on it, because how do we understand this public that we are talking about? For those who are listening to us might wonder what public, because this is not a uniform public that we are talking about. There are multiple publics that are reading or engaging with our work, who may or may not be interested in history, who may or may not understand the language that we write in. So if you can put some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I mean, I'll begin with exactly what I said. I don't think I'm a pedagogue or I'm a seer who has done this kind of training and knows everything about history, right? I'll give you one example of a sense one gets of historical writing, right? Something called the truth, something called the fact, and that these facts, whatever your grounds of evidence are, you take these facts and you go and you interpret them. I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, what about politics of asking questions? What about the times that determine things, right? What about so this in that context, this public, right? I'm actually intrigued by what the rickshaw pullers will tell me, what tour guides on Mughal monuments will tell me, what women in the home have told me, right? Public imagination. How does this weave into the complex textual tradition, right? Or the complex pictorial human condition, right? How do these relate to it? So these are very fuzzy grounds that we must take on. To me, I think this is I mean, right from the start of this controversy, I've been very interested in, not a defensive position. I mean, we all know that the Indian historians have been doing fantastic work, and I think the panelists brought this out. But isn't this the moment really then to revisit, in the interest of our own growth, right? What the public is, what the history is. I mean, these have been the questions, I think, very actively. They've been part of Indian historiography, whether it was, anti-colonial nationalist writings in the 80s, departure, radical histories of all kinds, indigenous feminist histories, right? What are the forms of erasure? Why is it that certain stories are getting told? Why is it, I want to ask the question, that history suddenly has become fashionable, right? What's leading to it? And why don't we align with the possibilities that are there for us in terms of presses, in terms of cohort, different kinds of platforms, such as Ishan's platform, right? It's a new way of documenting history. And those are the thoughts that I had in mind, where I was really, I felt very strongly that there is this kind of, binary. So I'll say one last thing, in my own writing, it has not been a matter of somehow tamping down or watering down the prose. All the abstractions here that I'm talking about, right? Including critically for my work. Why is it that certain kinds of histories were erased, not told, right? These are things I want to communicate to the readers. Not only that, in my exchanges with my readers, I'm actually getting fantastic ways of thinking. So the publics are sites of knowledge. We have to grant them, right? I'm not the seer in it. I think it's a dialectic. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Thank you so much, Professor Lal, for that brilliant answer. Continuing this and also taking Professor Deshpande's comment on this dangers of practicing the craft. I'll definitely come to you, Professor Venkat Chilapati. But Professor Guha, you also practice public archaeology in many ways. You engage in that field also, and I think archaeology is much more politicized now than history. We see that recently in the Caravan magazine there was a whole article written on how ASI has been fortifying the Hindutva sort of history. In that scenario, how do you feel about archaeology? Because sometimes when we talk of history, we somehow forget about archaeology and we make a distinction between history and archaeology.
Yeah, Ishan, archaeology has always been political. So the point is, if you think about it from the 19th century, when the discipline did not exist because there were antiquaries, and then, as I said, that there's a public face of archaeology. Archaeology is public facing, but discipline making. Archaeology throughout has been political. There has been, if you think in terms of, forget about India, anywhere else, what you excavate and what you find is what is sometimes demanded by the present milieu or your contemporary milieu. Now, in that light, archaeologists have also developed, and it's the conundrum which I actually think about and I work with, is they have developed this thing about scientific objectivity. Okay, so they go to the field and they say, we found this fact and we have interpreted it this way, and this is what it is. Not often telling people that you don't find facts on the field. Everything is interpretation. And as we know from being in history, what you interpret and how you come up with certain inferences are actually colored in the times in which you live in. So that's something you have to, archaeology has always had to engage with the contemporary world and what the contemporary world's demands have been. And I actually don't do public archaeology. You see, the point is you're talking to someone who's very anti-public in very many ways here, because I have actually dealt with a subject which is very, as I said, public facing. What is this public? who are the archaeologists kind of tipping in? So the way the archaeologist works in the field is they would go in their kind of coterie, and then they would talk down to the villagers or the laborers who work in the field. So you see, so they're also the public, but they're kind of taught what is to be expected. Then there is another public from which they need money. So they are given something else. And of course, archaeology from the 1970s, when we think in terms of India, archaeologists have done epic archaeology. So you have to think about B.B. Lal, Hashmukh Dheeraj Lal Sankalya. I mean, my own university has been doing it, Deccan College. And we've had the historians who've actually said that what they're doing needs to be tempered with, needs to be actually critiqued. Archaeologists haven't been a brilliant critique of their own work, very few. And when we talk today, yes, Caravan has brought this out, but I was in Vadnagar in 2023 with a professor of architecture from York University, trying to see what they're doing. So as you know, Vadnagar has been one of the first heritage villages which has come up. And we have had the Ecological Survey working there, saying that there is a continuous history there. There is a lot one should learn from that, because they've also built up a museum, which they're thinking is like the Acropolis Museum in Athens, because that museum has this glass floor, which is going to look onto the ruins. So, I'm writing on it. But what can I say for my own subject, which has been a political subject? Is why I wrote that book, Artifacts of History, saying that the minute you do a linear development of that subject and you pick up certain aspects which the British colonial people wanted you to pick up about archaeology, saying it's a much more better ways, it facilitates histories in a better way, you're actually following the colonialist historiography without not understanding it. Today, what they're kind of trying to do, they're telling you this is the decolonial way, or this is decolonization. As far as I'm concerned, they're recolonizing a field. And you see that happening in a way, in a very, very big way. So therefore, I work with, say, photographs, and I work with objects of archaeology, telling people that it's not field work, which kind of gives you a certain elan. It is actually when you work with the visual, when you work with objects, and photographs for me are objects, then you can see the very many histories you can actually pull out from one thing. And you see the very many complexities, the very many complex ways in which you can gather evidence, the very many ways in which you can endow historicity to something. And all this needs to come out. And all this does not come out when you kind of look at the methods of archaeology as field. So I, from within my discipline, have been a very strong critique of the specialist archaeology methodology. And heritage making, as you know, there's been so many people who have worked on it, on heritage. Heritage is what you actually do at a certain site. Heritage does not exist on the ground. Patrimony doesn't exist culture doesn't exist on the ground. So these are things which are being made. There are certain institutions in India, for example, the Aga Khan Trust. I'm a critique of that as well, because they have this authorized heritage discourse, which you get, but at least they are more transparent in their heritage making endeavors than the others are. So what we can do, what I think this is where the professional historian comes up, this is where the professional archaeologist comes up, is you make transparent your biases. And anybody with any salt to their subject would do that. You wear your biases on your sleeves and you tell, hey, this is what I have done, but these are the biases, these are the things with which I have come, and this is how I have seen an archive. And I want to bring here, because we've been talking about public history, public archaeology, and we talk about India, but thinking about the Western world. So I know somebody like David Olusoga, who is considered to be a public historian. He considers himself to be a public historian, Nigerian, half British. He does amazing work. He as he says, that he would not be even qualified to teach history because he did not have maths in his GCSEs. And his history has actually made policy changes in Britain, certain aspects towards the Black people and their participation in history. So public history has a very strong input if it doesn't have it in the public life, then what's the point of doing it? If your histories, for example, I mean, our histories, for example, we speak, but who are we speaking for? So you
Correct.
can think about Dalit histories, you can think about who, so, there is this question of authority. Who has
Correct.
given us the authority to speak for other people? So what this kind of a debate should actually address is issues of genre, issues of classification, issues of endowing authority, issues of who speaks for the past. I mean, we can bring all these up. But
Correct.
the conundrum which we have in our own writings is how do we put all that? We can write, and how do we then, when we teach students, how do we bring that up? So that, for me, public history has a huge, uh, enormous amounts of things for us. For me, for example, as a teacher in my class, to tell my students to think
Correct.
about. And that's where I would put this, without getting into the fact that the reason why historians feel beleaguered today, it's a political project. We know it.
Correct.
So
Thank you for that very important point that you have made. I'll come to Professor Lal, but before that, I'll go to Professor Venkat Chilapati because he's been waiting to speak for a long time. Over to you, sir.
Okay. I just want to add 2 points.
Yeah.
I agree with both Professor Deshpande and Professor Lal. Yes, the challenges are formidable, but at the same time, this is a moment of opportunity.
Mhm.
From my own experience, I can tell you that in the last 10 years, I have had more readers read my work than in the 30 years earlier. And most of them are younger people, inquisitive, curious, and they are challenging you. So I see it as a moment of opportunity. The second thing, as professional historians, I want all my fellow peers and fellow scholars to be Janus-faced. On the one side, we should be looking back and seeing that our peers respect our work, that they don't think that we are doing some kind of easy thing without doing adequate work. So on the one side, we have to ensure that our peers respect us, and at the same time we look forward and hope to interest readers, communicate to them without dumping it down. And I am really confident that dumping down actually doesn't help at all. So in my own experience, I'll give you one example. Nobody ever, I don't think, thought, writing about the history of coffee drinking is a worthwhile topic for research. I wrote it. It was published in a professional journal. But ultimately, it also was read by a huge number of readers, despite it having many quotes, many footnote references. So the publishers seem to think that the very presence of superscript numerals and notes at the bottom of the page is a turnoff. I don't think so at all. Certain books can certainly actually work only with that kind of apparatus. A new story requires, even for the neophyte reader, that there is substantiation at the bottom of the page itself. So I really don't think that we need to dumb down. We can tell complex stories, certain kinds of stories simply cannot be addressed to a larger audience. I am very, very hopeful despite the
Yeah.
lurking dangers.
I'll come to Professor Saikia also in a moment. Professor Lal, over to you. You wanted to add something to Professor
Yes, I
Guwahati.
just very quickly to Sudeshna's point about memorialization, right? In the context of the gerrymandering that's going on, right? And kind of, this history being wiped out of this NCRT and this kind of college curriculum, and it's a world phenomenon. So I think this project of how we memorialize, right? I think that is and that's why I kept on sort of mentioning, the politics of asking questions, right? And sometimes we will just ask questions. Let's not imagine that we have all the answers. I think that is That is a critical point. I just wanted to, add that to Sudeshna. And then this point about footnotes, right? I mean, sometimes people imagine, I've been told, oh, just reduce the footnotes. And, I mean, it's a crazy thing. I think people within the academic profession and outside, serious readers, right? They know that there is a parallel story that's going on. There's a parallel story of the story, but also you as witness, you as somebody who's documenting, you as somebody who's giving further leads, and also this idea that you don't necessarily know everything. I strongly believe in that position of uncertainty here in writing these stories.
Thank you so much, Professor Lal, Professor Saikia. And then I'll come to Professor Deshpande because to talk about how we remember and how we memorize, I think also the case of historical individuals like Chhatrapati Shivaji, case in point, and these days Aurangzeb is always in the news. I think Professor Deshpande might be able to shed some light on that. Professor Saikia, over to you.
Right. I think all of us do agree that Indian historians, they definitely deserve serious respect because they definitely have done commendable work over the years. Probably all their works, or probably some of their works, have not been read by the Indian readers who are equally intelligent, competent, primarily because maybe it is written in English, right? It is important that the publishing houses, they start publishing, translating these highly worthwhile works in the Indian languages. I think this will definitely help us to cope up with this present crisis. Think of probably say my co-panelist's work, right? All their works are really of great standard, right? But probably an Assamese reader, right, or a Bengali reader have not read their works, right? If they are not competent to read in a non-Bengali, non-Assamese language, probably. I think this is an important time for us to make it available in those languages. Second, equally, we must take Indian readers and their intelligence equally with due respect. I think they're really competent. I'm not talking about the people who are interested only in the WhatsApp University. I have no business with them, right? If they are important component of the Indian public, that is a different issue altogether. I'm not competent to engage with that subject. But I think these questions of readers and the translations of the great volume of work that Indian historians have done, right, in a very complex way, as Professor Lal has rightly pointed out, it is not an easy business. They're constantly struggling with many layers of questions. Their answers are also multifaceted, right? They have not been able to come out, but it is a continuous process that they have been engaged with. I think these works had helped the craft to evolve, to acquire a much more global status over a period of time. It has given Indian academic and professional historians much more kind of confidence that they require. But transition is important. We are definitely living in the 21st century in a very difficult and a very exciting time. People are not reading only books. People are also reading varieties of mediums to comprehend and probably to think about their past. And this is what exactly in different forms, probably our forefathers, they have done, predecessors, they have done probably 100 years before. They wrote about the past, not only in the prose narrative. They wrote novels, they wrote poetry, they wrote dramas, and obviously, there are issues, methods. We are not dealing with that. I think it is important for us to continue with those traditions and to strengthen the professional apparatus, professional mechanisms of Indian history writing processes.
Thank you so much, Professor Saikia, because we are also running out of time. I'll invite Professor Deshpande, and then I'll ask my two final questions, and that will be open for all the speakers to respond to. So Professor Deshpande, over to you on this idea of memorializing and the public at large in that respect.
I think we've had very interesting responses from the other panelists. My view is very simple. I don't think the public is really interested in the questions which we ask of our discipline. Those are important methodological, philosophical, and theoretical questions which we can ask in a forum which is not exactly public. On the other hand, what the public wants are answers. And that's where the public historian, the academic historian, doubling as the public historian, must speak in a voice of authority, which his training in historiography and the historical method, as somebody who practiced and who has practiced the craft of history over several years, should address. If he is not sure of his voice of authority, if he is not sure of the fact, if he is not confident, if his training and his long practice as a professional historian does not give him the confidence to answer the questions which the public is raising, then he cannot be a public historian. And this has happened for a very long time. You don't really have to be a university professor to do that, as we discussed in our previous meeting. I mean, you had people like Govind Pansare who took on all the dominant perspectives on Shivaji in 1988 when he wrote that very important and very popular book, Who Was Shivaji? And then you have, people like D.N. Jha who wrote that excellent book on beef eating in ancient India, because of which he had to seek police protection, which is called, the Holy Cow. You have, now you have many formats in which the historians are operating, as Professor Saikia pointed out. It's not only in many languages. You have many Hindi channels now dedicated to good source-based, research-based public history. I don't want to name them. One of those channels is the one which you are doing, this Karwan lecture series. You are yourself performing a yeoman service to the cause of both public as well as academic history, being our student as well. So I think in the same way as a doctor with a certain amount of medical training, surgical training, can speak with a certain amount of authority on his subject, which he need not necessarily discuss with his patient in the clinic. The historian has that weight of training, the weight of learning, and the weight of his discipline, which is a very old and classical discipline, behind him. And it is with that weight of that discipline that he should convey on all these issues of public histories. And some historians, some of my colleagues are doing it. They are doing it in multiple language formats as well. You have somebody like Prachi Deshpande, for that matter, who does it in English, who has also done it in Marathi. In Maharashtra, there are people who are doing it in English and the Marathi language both, making their work accessible to the public, which is not always English speaking. So historians have to speak with a certain amount of confidence. So I agree with Venkat Saab when he says that it's a very interesting time. Also, it's a time of great. I mean, it's not as if all the windows and doors have closed. It's a time of great opportunity for historians to intervene in these debates, say their bit, and people like Audrey Truchke or Pillai and so on. They are saying these things, and other historians are also speaking, even as this debate on Chava and so on is raging in the media. Other voices are also being raised politely and on the basis of facts and sources. And I think that's the way the historical debate ultimately will unfold to a point when hopefully the public becomes more tolerant of dissenting voices and differing perspectives on the past. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. Now, my two final questions to also summarize the whole discussion, because this discussion can go on for many hours. And I think we must do another part of this conversation later on and continue this conversation and panel so that we can create a more, hopefully, a more discerning audience that we all are trying to do for the last. Karwan has been doing it for the last 5 years, and I hope to continue this. But many best-selling popular histories in India, I think it is coming out in large numbers now, uh, are criticized for weak methodology and ethics of writing history. when lawyers write history and when doctors write history, it becomes very difficult for historians and history students to actually come to terms with that kind of public history. It's not always history leaning writers writing history. All sorts of people are writing history. So is it possible for popular history to maintain that rigorous historical standard and yet be popular among the people? Because you also have written those best-selling books yourselves. So, Professor Lal, you wanted to answer this, yes?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was saying in my opening remarks, right? The position of self-introspection on both sides, right? For the academic historian to know that the craft is not given. It's constantly evolving, which involves many things. But also for the non-academic, I'll put it more broadly. I'm wary of the word popular. We'll talk about it in the next panel. But let's say the non-academic historian, I think it's very important, and I think all the panelists have been saying this, that it's very important for them to understand that there are intricacies in our engagements of the archive or archaeological sites or memorialization or projects of heritage making. It is not like, you just you have a text somewhere there, you know that the Akbarnama is translated in English, so you can go ahead and write, right? I think that's a position of arrogance, which I think actually neither side must have. There is no final definitive answer. I'll give you one example from this latest book of mine on Gulbadan. I started my career 20 years ago reading her manuscript, which is housed in the British Library. It breaks off on folio 83. And I have seen 4 books down, I came to writing about her because I discovered some 5 eviction orders by Sultan Murad III of Ottoman Turkey, who was then the sovereign of the Holy Lands where Gulbadan had gone. These are housed in the National Archives in Istanbul, and it puts a wholly different perspective to the biography that I wrote. Whereas in the midst, I had seen tweets of this kind by, people saying, oh, there's only one manuscript of Gulbadan available. Does anyone know of any other, right? Would you tell me if you find it? It's not a matter of whether do you know another. The point is, what does an historian do with that void, right? What are the conditions in which that void happens, especially from a very powerful royal figure around her book, right? When it was known that in the Mughal atelier, you had 6 to 8 copies of every work that was produced, was commissioned. So why is it? This is a book by a memory holder, written at the invitation of her nephew, the great emperor, right? So these are this is a very, very small and simple intricacy, but I would suggest that, those are things to work through, even in writing, popular histories.
That's an important point that you have, I think, raised in this. And any other panelists who would like to? Uh, yes, Professor Saikia.
Yes, I agree that history writing is not the sole privilege of the historians, right? Everyone has a right to read, to engage, to produce about the past, right? But it is also the questions of scholarship, right? It is a long-term involvement with the questions, with the archives, with the past, right? And how you are trying to make sure that the writings, your findings, and finally your finished product has acquired the kind of sophistications, kind of maturity, and the kind of general standardization that needs to achieve, whether it has achieved or not, right? We have seen that many people, probably who are computer scientists, other technocrats, have written fine works on wide range of historical subjects, right? It is essentially questions of scholarships and the kind of questions and in your engagement with the questions, right? How committed you are to answer those questions. So I agree that this is not a privilege of the historians. Others have equal right, equal stake, and this is the beauty of the subject. I don't think other disciplines will have that kind of competitions, right? Because our stakes, our civilizational involvements are involved with this historical lens. And this has allowed everyone, but my only stake will be that we really require the kind of sophistication and scholarships that probably any other disciplines, any other professions, like a doctor, like an engineer, would like to strive for, right? This is how I would like to comment on.
Professor Go, you want to add something to this?
I don't know. I mean, you just saw me doing this. So
I thought you wanted to
yeah,
add
so
something.
look, there is a thing about the public intellectual and the public historian, or a public this or a public that. And there have been historians of science elsewhere who have actually very well, very, very clearly conveyed the intricacies of something through the BBC channels, through news, etc. I mean, I can name many people. Bruno Latour. I mean, there's a whole lot of them. My point here is that when, for example, a physicist, right, can write about physics. If a historian writes about physics, nobody would read that stuff. What is happening in this history field is everybody seems to be writing about history. We cannot stop that. And it's not only computer scientists, economists have written about histories too. And I'm sure you all know what I'm alluding to. One of the first books which came out and is that. But think about it in our classrooms. If I go and teach, say, medieval Indian history, I mean, these are also, classifications I talk about. I don't become an authority on medieval Indian history. I just teach my undergraduate class that subject. Somebody else does the writing. We are all trained in our own specific fields. We cannot, it's a question of democracy here. We cannot stop somebody else from writing. However, when it comes to, and this is where I want to bring this conversation to as well, that when it comes to kind of assigning a syllabus, and you say, my students, history students, are studying what? I would, in my syllabus, give them something which has been written by a historian rather than, for example, a history of archaeology written by a computer scientist, which has been happening as well. And I think that is where I keep that distinction very, very clear, that you are training a professional group here. And what are you training them in? You can't stop other people from writing something. Some of these things will be very good. But as I think Rubilal pointed out very clearly, is when you are not within your subject, and I hear it comes to also very subject specialization. You can pick up on everything, but you're eliminating something. You never say why that elimination happens. You also don't say why you have selected something. Whereas if you are from within that subject, you would make that very clear. And that is what I have trouble with many of these histories. Like, I don't want to mention names, but these are histories which are now prolific, both in Bengal, Deccan, Tamil Nadu. I've just come back from a big conference on the Indus civilization where everybody was talking about the Indus civilization, let's just say, from people in the management. I mean, in Bangalore, everybody was an authority on this. What am I going to tell my students? What am I going to tell my students to read? What will I? So this is where I make a distinction. That's all I want to say, because actually public historians, and I come from I guess it's a bigger world, because I think in terms of histories of science, I think in terms of many other kinds of histories, not only histories of a subject, a country, or whatever, there have been people who have been very, very good within the profession to convey that beautifully, with all the complexes, with all the problems out in the field. But as I've always said, you need to be a very, very good historian to be able to do so.
Thank you so much, Professor Guha. I think in this panel, we have touched upon a lot of important issues, from the dangers of writing and working as historians in present India to the pressures of trade publishing. I think what a lot of you also pointed out, because sometimes they dictate what you should write on, and the question of footnotes and how to make academic history popular. I think the final question to all of you, and I hope all of you can respond to that. And it's a very provocative question. So already many apologies for that. But is it fair to say that academic historians have failed, or has the public itself has become less receptive to the complexity and nuance required for serious historical inquiry? So we'll start from Professor Lal.
Short answer is no and no. I don't think public historians have failed. I mean, that's exactly what we are doing here. I mean, I call myself an academic historian. That's who I am, but I write for the public as well, right? But it is deeply, I do not think I would have done the books that I do for a wider audience in the trade mode that I've written without, all the layers and complexities that we are talking about that Sudeshna finally summed up just before I spoke. So, and I've been an ardent speaker of the publics. This is my big sort of question. We cannot assume that we are going to go tell the public, right? That we are the seers and holders of knowledge. I think there is a lot of learning we need to do. I think. Because if we go with that viewpoint of as a figure of authority, then I think it completely reduces the thought of the people who are not in our space, in our institution, right? And I mean, if my work cannot speak to people outside the institution that I work for, or my classroom, or my colleagues, then what kind of work am I doing? Right? That's my question. So no, we are truly well and alive and thriving and flourishing. We have, I think, fantastic. This is, as Professor Saikia said, this is a really important moment, moments for us to continue thinking.
Professor Venkat Chelapati, you should also, I think it is important for us to mention that Professor Venkat Chelapati, I think, is among one of the only panelists here who has also written in Tamil, and has written first in Tamil and then his work has been translated, which is, I think, a very important thing. Yes, over to you, sir.
Ishan, you asked a provocative question, so I should give a provocative answer. India has lots of people employed in the various history departments of colleges and universities. A very small fraction of them are actually historians, and they're right. I don't think you can blame many of them. They have been doing their job. It is about this vast sea of people who are neither teaching nor doing research who are to blame. But our tribe should increase. There should be more readers. I think the thing about the beauty of the discipline, as Arup mentioned, is that, you cannot become a physicist just by reading a few books on physics. But it's likely that, if you read a good number of works of history, it's very likely that you will imbibe a sense of history. And that is at the foundation of the making of a historian. That is the beauty of discipline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Venkat Chelapati. Professor Deshpande, over to you.
I agree both with with Professor Lal and Dr. Venkat Chelapati. And I just wish to say that in our own limited way, we will continue to contribute to the development of a critical historical culture in our society. All societies have historical cultures, but in India, unfortunately, the views are always so polarized that it sometimes becomes difficult for the critical public historian to be heard in that cacophony of views and ideologies which goes on and passes off as history. So I think we are all public historians in some way or the other. It is also too much to expect, as Venkat pointed out, and I agree with that. It is too much to expect the large body of Indian history teachers who are overburdened with school, college, and university work to be able to find work to actually write public histories. So, number one, all the teachers of history are not historians. It is also too much to expect all academic historians to perform uh, in both formats, academic as well as public. But then there will be people like Dr. Venkat Charapati, like me, like Ruby, and others who will work in both formats. I mean, you pointed out the fact that he's written in Tamil. I would like to also tell you that I have also written in Hindi as well. So, in fact, my naval history book was published in Hindi by Akar, and fortunately or unfortunately, very few people have bought it and read it. So it also depends upon marketing, depends upon how you market yourself, how the publisher takes things to the public, and things like that. So there are so many factors which go into making the historical culture of a country, and I think we are in our own limited ways, we are doing our best to enrich the development of a proper historical culture in this country. And the debate goes on.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. Professor Saikia?
Yes, I think, let me agree with all my co-panelists. I think Indian historians, they have succeeded in their work, in their profession, in their passion. And it is also a craft. Just by doing little bit of some videos and others, I cannot become a filmmaker, right? Probably a few minutes of experience of taking videos will not make me a filmmaker, right? In a similar way, I think few anecdotal informations will not turn me into a historian, but in that capacity, Indian historians, teachers, I think they're all doing good work, but I think it requires more introspection. We need to go forward, right? We must be happy with the subjects, but we should also remove all the difficulties. We should we should try to understand the challenges in a much more comprehensive manner so that we can remove the challenges, remove the obstacles, and put the discipline in a much more sophisticated and a profound manner.
Thank you so much, Professor Saikia. Professor Deshna Guha?
I think they've said it all. The only thing I would say is that because we are talking about histories, we should also remember the histories. If we think in terms of history writing from the 1920s or even earlier, and I'm just picking up 1920s because that's when Indian historians started writing for the nationalist movement and things like that. They all wrote, most of them, in their regional vernacular languages. In archaeology, for example, I'm in Deccan College, all my professors wrote in Marathi. They would have an English book and they would have something in Marathi. So the point is that historians, archaeologists, professionals who have been academics, they have tried to get their work out in the public domain all throughout history. And when we do the introspection, we should actually read those works as well to see the ways in which they had done it. So it's not a very easy thing to kind of be able to do it in both formats. And everybody wants their work read. So obviously that's there. But to keep and it's not about me or my work or you, because that is the other thing which has happened with all of this, that there are these literary festivals where people get invited. So if you think you write more accessible work, then you would be a bigger hero. I mean, there are all kinds of things which has come in today's academic life, which we also need to think about. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Guha, and thank you so much to all our panelists for taking out time. Because if I may add some concluding remarks to this whole discussion, and not concluding, actually continuing remarks for the next debate or discussion that we'll have, because the interplay between academic and non-academic or popular history public history in India is a dynamic and an evolving field. I think there's so much more to come in the times that we'll see. While academic history provides a deep and rigorous study that is needed to understand the complexities of the past, public history or popular history in that sense ensures this knowledge reaches a wider audience, and I think it has proven over these years how the books have done, if that is a bar to check how popular they are. Some of those books have created new myths about history, and some have demolished previous myths. I think books have done both the work. In a time of growing historical revisionism and misinformation, it is more critical than ever to foster spaces where history is debated, questioned, and celebrated if we can. By bridging the gap between academia and the public, we can ensure in some ways that India's rich and pluralistic histories continue to inspire and inform future generations and even my generation who are studying in universities right now. Academics, social media platforms, writers, and public platforms and historians are working together now more than ever to challenge misinformation and foster a culture of critical inquiry. And public history, in that sense, plays a very important role here, translating academic insights into relatable narratives without compromising integrity, to a larger extent. And expecting historians alone to popularize their work is unrealistic. Like scientists, as some of you also pointed out, their primary responsibility lies in research. At a time when public sphere is influenced by dominant ideologies and public history is not untouched by them, criticizing academic historians only serve those who seek to find faults in academic history in a large way. And I hope that this discussion actually helps you understand the whole dynamics of writing history or working as historians and reaching out to a larger audience, to their students initially, because all historians also teach history in universities to a whole bunch of students who may or may not know about that discipline when they get into universities. So, with that, I think public and academic history need not to be at odds, but complement each other as they always do. Public historians can use and they use academic research done by historians to craft compelling narratives for a broader audience. And academics continue to engage with the public as they were doing since a long time. This is not a new phenomena, as all of you pointed out, and Professor Lal gave an example of our teacher, Professor Romila Thapar, and others of her generation who were always very public and gave lectures, wrote pamphlets against the time that they were working in. So, with that, I think creating accessible platforms, this is for those who are listening from different backgrounds of publishing and literary circles. Creating platforms like literature festivals, public forums, and social media channels can help amplify the voices of academicians. Rather than blaming historians for perceived inaccessibility, we must address systematic barriers and promote spaces where history, academic or public, can coexist. Only then we can create a society that values a nuanced understanding of the past, is what I think I believe in, and I hope that others will pick up, because this discussion will go on. But as all of us discussed, that there is a good future ahead of us. I think we all are optimistic about that, and nobody can stop writing histories, but public must also take larger interest as they are doing right now. With that, thank you so much, Professor Guha, Professor Lal, Professor Saikia, Professor Venkat Chilapati, and Professor Deshpande, along with about 50 people who are watching us on YouTube live, and those who will watch us later on. There were about 15 questions for you in the live chat, which we couldn't address today. But if those who are watching us and send their questions, if you want your questions answered, please write to us on carvanheritage@gmail.com. and write to us to whom you want to question, and we will send your questions to the panelists, and they'll can get the answers to you via email. With that thought, thank you so much for joining in. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep questioning. That's how you'll keep yourself sane